implicit learning of complex patterns, tracking of causal patterns to do that. But it's also picking up on the bad invariants. It's picking up on, right? It's helping to reveal all the ways in which you are systematically misframing. So that like a child going through a developmental stage, and I would point to you to the work of my former student and friend, colleague Junsun Kim, for this idea of development as a systematic form of insight. Something that he and I are working on together. Like a child going through a developmental stage, realizing not just this error or that error, but a systematicity in the way that they're misframing reality and finding a nexus, a point of where the insight, right, is not just an intervention in this problem, but in a whole class and type of problems. That developmental change of seeing through illusion and into reality that is so central to wisdom is also being afforded by these higher states of consciousness. What about the decentering that's so central to both flow, mystical experiences, and then ultimately to higher states of consciousness? My colleague, Igor Grossman, has produced quite a bit of good experimental evidence that such decentering strategies, although this was prefigured in earlier work by the Berlin Paradigm, Igor Grossman has done some excellent work on showing that such decentering strategies are very relevant for bringing about wisdom. He has work on what he calls the Solomon effect. Let me describe it to you. You'll see why these disruptive decentering strategies can be so powerful. Get people to find a problem that's very messy, problematic, and that they're stuck in. Usually it's an interpersonal problem. Because, as Sartre said, hell is other people. So is heaven, by the way. He didn't say that. But, right, our deepest and most pervasive problems are generally problems with other people. Why? Because the thing that is, I've mentioned this before, that is most predictive of how meaningful your life is your meaningful relationships to others. The problem is human beings are endlessly complex. Okay? So you're describing this interpersonal problem, and when people describe it, they are, of course, mesmerized by the mirage of their own egocentric perspective. They describe it without thought, default, from the first-person perspective, and they remain stuck. Remember this notion of stuckness. We'll come back to it again when we talk about Gnosis and Gnosticism. Then you get the person to re-describe the same problem from the third-person perspective. You get them to decenter. What will often happen is they will break frame. They will realize the way in which they have been blocked, systematically locked in not solving their problem. They'll often have a central insight into how to resolve their problem. This is why it's called the Solomon effect, because it tends to make you more wise. Think about the radical decentering that's going on in these awakening experiences, in these higher states of consciousness. Notice the systematicity of the error of egocentrism. It's not an error in this problem, or this problem, or this problem. It's a systematic error. That's why it's often described with metaphors of like being asleep. Because when you wake up, you have a systematic change in your consciousness. So what's happening in these higher states of consciousness, in these awakening experiences, you're getting a transformation, an intervention in systematic error. You're seeing through illusion precisely because of the powerful decentering that they are affording for you. Now that, of course, can be a powerfully traumatic experience. It can be a terrifying experience. Pursuing this in an autodidactic fashion, like all autodidactic, being a completely self-taught, right, is very, very dangerous. Autodidacts tend to get into echo chambers, vicious circles of their own egocentric entombment and entrapment. The Buddha gives a wonderful parable about this. He says, this is how you catch a monkey. You put some pitch on a piece of wood and it looks like something very shiny and tasty. It's salient, it's attractive. And so the monkey grabs it with its hand and it gets stuck. And then it uses its other hand to try and free itself. And it gets stuck. So it uses its right foot and then its left foot. And then it puts its head, its mouth on, and then it's completely trapped. And then the hunter comes and kills it. Okay. But decentering can alleviate that. But if you are still pursuing this as an isolated individual, as an autodidact, then think about how ill-prepared, unskilled, untutored, and egocentrically you are trying to confront this radical transformation. That is why I think it is a very poor idea for people to take psychedelics without having them placed within a wisdom tradition in which they have a committed community that can give outside, decentering, and wise advice for how to process and handle these transformations. But once again, I point to you to an aspect of the meaning crisis. We have institutions of information, we have institutions of knowledge, we have traditions, and we have respected experts who give us guidance. We do not have this before wisdom. Now, what is amazing, of course, is that some individuals, like Siddhartha, are able to do it as individuals. I want to point out two things about that. They deserve our admiration for successfully doing it as individuals, even though the Buddha had training from other people all along the way. But we should not take from that some kind of promotion of our North American individualism. Because the Buddha made it very clear that the Sangha, the community, was necessary for the cultivation of these transformative states. So, you've got this radical decentering. It can afford wisdom. And I want to try and show you how it's not just a perspectival knowing, it's not just a radical transformation in our salience landscape. This is a participatory change. This involves not just the machinery of cognition or the machinery of consciousness. This alters the machinery of the self, and therefore is also fundamentally a transformation of character. Remember, participatory knowing is knowing by conforming. Well, the radical at oneness of these brings about a radical kind of participatory knowing. We'll come back to this when we return and talk about Plotinus, but right, it's so beautiful precisely because the coupling is so profound. And think about, you're getting reciprocal revelation. The world is revealing itself more deeply, and more depths of yourself are being revealed in a coupled fashion. Well, that's love. Love is mutually accelerating disclosure. If you want somebody, if you want to fall in love with somebody, although you can never sort of pursue it that way, I think. But what happens is, if you get two people mutually disclosing from each other in a coupled fashion, I honestly disclose something about myself, and then you in response disclose, and then I pick that up and disclose more, and then you disclose. That reciprocal, enhanced, mutual conforming engenders love. Love is something you know by participating in it, like your culture and your language. This is knowing by loving. And what I want to suggest to you is that some recent cognitive science research can give us some understanding about why this decentering, this transformation of the sense of self, might be functional here. There's a lot of work. I would recommend to you the work of Suey and Humphrey from 2015, for example, showing that one of the functions of yourself, right, not your mind, but yourself, is to act as glue. This is a term they use. It's a metaphor. By making things relevant to myself, I can make them relevant to each other and glue them together. So, and I'm always doing that, right? I'm simultaneously gluing things together as I'm gluing myself together. What the self is a powerful set of functions for integrating, actually complexifying, processing. To say you have a self is to say you have a systematic set of functions that are integrating, not homogenizing, complexifying things together. Now, if you remember, we talked about the work of Michael Anderson, acceptation, the acceptation of the tongue. Here's a proposal to you. This powerful machinery that is central to your cognitive agency, your ability to make sense of the world by gluing the world together as you're gluing yourself together, this powerful machinery of complexification, of information and information processing can be exapted. What if you were to take all that machinery of integration that you're using to integrate yourself and you turned it onto the world? What if you took all of that capacity to glue things together and you exapted it on the world? That would mean that machinery that was normally self-focused, about integrating the self, integrating its processing, could be used to achieve a deeper integration of the world, to reveal deeper underlying patterns. Novark in 96, Claxton in 2000, both suggest, with argumentation and with phenomenological evidence, and many reports from people who are undergoing mystical experiences seem to corroborate this, that what seems to happen is all of the energy and machinery that has been bound up in our self has been turned onto the world. That's why the world comes alive to us, and we see so deeply into it. Imagine the intimacy you have in your self-knowledge being turned on to the world. So all of that energy that's stored up in your egocentric processing, all the time and the resource, and all the, who am I? What's going on? Oh, how's it? Oh, how's it? All of that. Imagine if you could take that machine and say, forget about John Vervaeke. Just for a while, even. Turn all that massive machine onto the world. Radical decentering, I propose to you, is doing exactly that. All of the time and effort and processing and skill and memory and structures that we've built into our ego can be exapted to disclose the world. And that, of course, would be coupled with a radical sense of moving into the being mode, a radical sense of remembering who and what we really are. So, what I've tried to show you is we can understand the higher cognitive process at the psychological level in terms of this decentering, the acceptation of the self machinery, flowing optimal grip, right? Enhanced awareness of invariance, both in the positive sense and in the ability that allows us to pick up on systematic error. We can see why this machinery is operating and producing the experiential profile it is producing. What about at the information processing level? I don't want to get very technical here, but this is the level at which we turn to work that's being done in machine learning, artificial intelligence, where people are actually trying to make machines that make sense of the world. And what kind of strategies do they come up with for trying to get the machines to be better learners? Well, one interesting thing is precisely the use of disruptive strategies. So Woodward et al. In 2014, this is a direct quote from them, right? I'll give you the quote in a sec. They introduced randomization into a neural network. A neural network is a very powerful and cutting-edge form of artificial intelligence that in some important ways mimics how brains work. When you're training these neural networks, you don't program them, you train them to learn for themselves. Right? But very often what you have to do is you have to introduce noise, entropy, randomness into these networks. In fact, he goes on to say that such randomness, quote, is an essential aspect of the self-optimization process. You have to, these are not people doing psychology, these are not people trying to understand higher states of consciousness. What they're trying to do is they're trying to make neural networks that learn better, that can self-optimize, and what they do, what they say is essential, that's the word he used, to this is disruptive strategies. Why? See, the problem with powerful machines is they pick up on patterns. And you say, well, but John, that's good. Isn't picking up patterns good? Well, remember all the stuff we've talked about when we talked about implicit learning and picking up on only correlational patterns, not picking up on real patterns. See, the problem you face is you're always sampling from the world. So here's your experience, and then here's the world. And there's some pattern in your experience. And what you want to know is that pattern in the world or not? We invented a whole discipline to deal with this. It's called statistics. All statistics is basically this problem. How do I know if the patterns in my sample are the same as the patterns in the world? How do I know that? Right? So, for example, if I was in class at U of T and let's say it's an even huge class, 500 students, Psych 100, and I say, how many people here think that student tuition should be reduced or school should be free? And they all put up their hands. Should I then conclude, look, the overwhelming majority of people think that student tuition should be reduced? You'd say, that's ridiculous, and this is what you should say, because that is not a representative sample. The pattern there is all students. You need the sample to have the same patterns as the environment. So why is that relevant to disruption? Very often, what will happen with these neural networks is they will overfit to the data. They will too tightly pick up on the pattern in the sample, a pattern that does not generalize to the rest of the world. So let me give you a way of understanding this graphically. So very often, right, we're like, you've been probably taught this, right? You do a scatter plot, you point your point, right? And then you don't typically draw a line like this to try and capture the data. Instead, what we typically do is a line of best fit, which might not touch any of the data points. This is called data compression, the line of best fit. Why do we do that? We do that in science because what we're trying to find is the function that will generalize, that will go to all kinds of different contexts. that will not be true just of this sample, but will be true of the population. But what the networks do is they do this. They overfit to the data. They track a function that perfectly describes the sample, but does not generalize to the population. Precisely because they're so powerful, they overfit. So what do? Well, you can throw some noise into the system. You can turn off, you can do dropout, you can turn off half of the nodes. You basically disrupt the processing a lot. Because what the disruption does is it prevents you from overfitting to the data, and it actually allows you to compress. And what does the compression do? It allows you to find the real invariants, the real patterns that will generalize across all the varying contexts. Now, of course, right, you don't want to underfit. If you underfit, then you're not picking up on any patterns at all. So, notice again, these systems have to toggle. They have to toggle back and forth. They have to disrupt, right? Very analogous to breaking frame in order so they can make a better frame. And they're trying to find that sweet spot between disruptive variation and compression to detect real patterns that allows them to become good learners. So what we know is that, again, you have to have disruptive strategies set within powerful pattern detection. That's exactly what we're seeing at work, as I mentioned to you, in these people that are pursuing these higher states of consciousness. It's also, again, why belonging to a tradition that can afford powerful pattern detection, introduce disruption when needed, and guide you to help toggle to find the sweet spot is very, very important. If you want to be really good at jamming, right, you have to have the requisite skill. Jamming without jazz jamming without skill just gives you junk. It doesn't give you jazz. So what's going on in the brain? Notice what I'm showing you here. The machines are doing, right, the compression. That compression is, right, that toggling of attention that you see going on in the higher state of they're disrupting and then compressing, and they're trying to find the huge invariance patterns, but they're trying to break frame, and they're doing stuff that seems, I think, plausible to say is analogous to what we see going on at the psychological level within people. What about at the brain level? Well, this is where we have to turn to Newberg, because he's done most of the work on tracking brains as people are having these kinds of experiences. And what you see is, right, initially you get increased activity in the frontal area and the parietal area. These are the two areas, the frontal-parietal connection, that is most associated with your general intelligence, your ability to make sense and get an optimal grip on the world, because that's what your general intelligence is. So initially you see these areas get hyperactive, and then you see the opposite. You see them hypoactive. So, huge increase followed by a huge decrease. Now, throughout all of this is the frontal parietal, you have enhanced activity in the thalamus. This is the area of the brain that tries to integrate all kinds of different information together. The greater the shift, the greater the disruptive shift, the more powerful the awakening experience is. It's just like what's going on in insight. You initially bring all this machinery to bear to frame it, and then you have to massively disrupt it and break it. And then the system self-organizes. And that is precisely what's going on, I would suggest to you, in these experiences. So what is happening in the brain, for example, in psychedelic experiences, is you'll often see this kind of shift. What's important, and there's a bunch of people doing work on this, metastability. What, for example, psilocybin does, according to recent work done by Lord et al., is it increases metastability in the brain. So if you look at the work of Kelso, Tognoli, and others, what metastability is a state in the brain that's doing this complexification I talked about. So normally your brain is integrating things or segregating, integrating, differentiating. But in psilocybin, what you get is a state called metastability where, and this is a state in which the brain is simultaneously integrating and segregating. It is massively complexifying. Please remember, complexification is with us when a system is both integrating and differentiating. When you went from being a zygote to being a biologically complex organism, your cells were differentiating into different types of cells, liver cells, eye cells, etc., but they were also integrated. You are complex because you're both highly integrated and highly differentiated. Complexification gives you emergent functions. It gives you new abilities. You can do things as a person, right, a biological human being, that you couldn't do as a zygote precisely because you're complex. Look, emergent functions come with the fact, because I'm highly differentiated, I can do many different things, but because I'm highly integrated, I don't fall apart as a system by doing these many different things. I get new emergent abilities. The way you grow and self-transcend as a system is by complexifying. Psilocybin, by putting you into metastability, right, helps your brain complexify and come up with emergent abilities. It allows you to see the world, massive integration, in a grain of sand, massive differentiation. So, I think what we can see here is, at least highly plausible, and I'll come back to what I mean by that in just a minute, count at the psychological level, at the machine processing level, and at the brain level of what is going on in these higher states of consciousness and why they are so powerfully optimizing your cognitive functionality. Once again, not to repeat this, that of course has to be placed within the proper sapiential context. You need a tradition and institutions, a committed community of cultivating wisdom. What about the prescriptive argument? I've laid a lot of the groundwork for this. Why should we listen to people who have been in this state? Why should this state serve as the justification for a transformation of your life? If someone comes up to you and says, I want you to transform your life according to X, Y, Z, right? You need that claim justified, not just described, explained, you need it justified. What would make it a good thing to do? Are these states actually good guides for transformation? Well, in order to do that, I need to introduce a notion to you first. We're going to come back to this notion again when we talk about the nature of cognitive science. Although I've been exemplifying a lot of cognitive science to you throughout these previous videos. This is the notion of plausibility. We need to talk about this because plausibility is central to your notion of how real things are. Now, there's two senses of the word plausible. One is a synonym for highly probable. That's not the sense I'm using. I'm using it in the sense that Rescher and others made famous, where this means makes good sense. Stands to reason. Right? Should be taken seriously. Most of the time, and I'll make this point in detail in a few minutes, you cannot base your actions on certainty, but you have to rely on plausibility. Now, there's a lot of work on plausibility, and I'm just going to try to sketch to you what I think, work I'm doing with Leo Ferraro and Anderson Todd about trying to integrate work by Lombardi and Nashman and Sinatra from 2015, Kyle 2006, Milgram 1997, Kischer, Rescher, I should say. There's just a lot of different work going into this. Here's what I think it is to make something plausible. First of all, it involves what Rescher calls trustworthiness. I think there's an important way in which trustworthiness comes about. You can see this in some of the work that Kyle has done on explanations we prefer. We regard a particular proposal or construct or some way of trying to model the world as trustworthy if it's been produced by many independent but converging lines of evidence. Let me give you a clear, concrete example. Right? You will regard as more real information that comes through multiple senses as opposed to one sense. If I'm only seeing something, there's a good chance that it's an illusion or a delusion caused by the subjectivity of my seeing. But if I can see it and touch it and hear it and smell it, then the chance is that each one of those independent senses are producing an illusion is radically diminished. The fact that they all are telling me the same thing, it doesn't give me certainty, but it gives me trustworthiness. It reduces the probability, that's what trustworthiness is, right? It reduces the probability that I'm self-deceived. That's not the same thing as certainty, because unfortunately, for example, there is a form of schizophrenia in which people not only hear voices, but they see people attached to those voices, and when they reach out to touch the person, they get a tactile illusion. It's very hard to convince those people that their illusions aren't real, precisely because this is highly trustworthy. This is why science likes numbers. We like numbers because they allow us to converge the senses. Look, you can see 3. You can touch 3. 1, 2, 3. You can hear 3. We like numbers not because we're fascists or something in science. We like numbers because numbers, quantification, help us to increase the trustworthiness of our information gathering. They allow us to reduce the chance that what we're getting, what we're measuring, what we're modeling is being produced by self-deception. Is that enough for plausibility? I don't think so. So we're converging to some processing state here. But we also want something to be the case. Because we're not just looking backwards into how we got there, we're also looking forward what we can do with it. What we want is we want a model that we can now apply to many new domains. That will open up the world for us. That's multi-apt. This is like, again, taking a martial arts stance. I don't use this, but I'm taking this stance because I can quickly adapt it to many different situations. It's multi-apt. It's highly functional. So why do I want this? Right? When I can use the same model in many different places, this is, I would argue, what people mean when they say a theory or a model is elegant. You use the same model, right? It's adaptive enough, it's multi-apt that you can use it in many different places and apply it. So you have convergence for trustworthiness, but you have elegance for power, multi-aptness, multi-apt application. that enough?
No.
No.
Right?
Right?
I think this state has to be highly fluent to you.
Remember we talked about this. This has to be one that you can use readily, powerfully for yourself, that you can internalize. When you have this, you have fluency, convergence, elegance. Right? You need one more thing. You need a balance between the convergence and the elegance. If I have a lot of convergence without much elegance, that's triviality. The thing about trivial statements is not that they're false, they're true, but they're not powerful. They don't transform. Many times we reject things, we don't take them seriously, they don't make good sense to us, precisely because they're trivial. What's the opposite? Very little convergence with a lot of promise of power. This is when things are far-fetched. Conspiracy theories have this feature. If they were true, they would explain so much. If we would just accept that the British royal family were lizard beings from outer space, we could explain so much of their behavior. But the problem is, although that would be a very powerful explanation, we have very little trustworthy evidence that that is in fact the case. So what we want is that, as Milgram says, our backward commitments and our forward commitment matter. We only commit powerfully forward if we've got a lot of trust in the model that we've produced. When all of this is in place, right? I think we find what we're processing not only fluent, we find it highly plausible. When we have very deep convergence and very deep elegance and very efficient fluency, I think we then find the proposal profound. So you're saying, why are you going on about this? Because what I'm trying to show you is what the brain is doing is performing a kind of evaluation of the plausibility of its processing when it's in a higher state of consciousness. See this model? What did we see? What did we see? We saw lots of things going into a higher state of consciousness. We saw de-automatization. Right? We saw decentering. All of these things are strategies for reducing bias. Reducing bias. These are all strategies for reducing bias. Right? De-automatization. Decentering. Fluency in processing. The state that you're in is a state of flowing optimal grip. It's intrinsically valued. It's optimizing for processing. And what's this affording, this state? Well, you're finding a nexus for development. You're finding that systematic error. You're getting that complexification of your processing. You're getting emergent new functions. You're getting the exaptation of machinery, the insight machinery, and the self machinery into new abilities. See what I'm arguing? The brain is in a state in which it's getting information that's saying this processing is deeply trustworthy, deeply powerful, deeply fluent,
therefore profoundly plausible. Plausibility is not certainty. Plausibility is what we have to rely on. What do I mean by that? You can't get certainty for almost all of your processing. You have to rely on plausibility all the time. You say, but I could turn to science. Science will give me certainty. First of all, pay attention to the history of science. When has it ever done that? Almost all of the theories that have been proposed in science have ultimately turned out to be